All right, so thank you for joining me today, Delaney.
Absolutely.
Uh,
Happy to
and
be on.
and you're coming off doing a talk, right? At Utah JS, was it?
Yeah, so a little while back they were looking for speakers and they asked Carson to come speak and they said, hey, is there anybody else that uh, in here? And she's like, yeah, you should talk to Delaney. He completely disagrees with me on the details. So
Nice.
that's very magnanimous of Carson to say, yeah, like bring on other voices that disagree. So
Yeah, so let's talk about that disagreement. So, but you're in the hypermedia world, you would say, right?
yeah, 100%. So a little bit of background. I do a bunch of real-time dashboard stuff from uh, very large systems, military applications, all that kind of stuff. And um, I've been kind of bit by doing it the spa way for a long time. And I really dove into the hypermedia as a concept. And I think Carson's did amazing things in that space to really bring it to the forefront. Um, and I wanted to push it farther than he cares to. So that's yeah, 100%.
Gotcha. Okay. So when you say farther, so I'll give my like basic understanding of what you're talking about first of all. Carson Gross and HTMX in general, the way I've heard it described is kind of adding sort of the fundamental building blocks of hypermedia as it should have been with HTML, and it's more of a low level system of controls that sort of gives people the access that they've sort of only been able to before with JavaScript, whether it's vanilla JavaScript or a framework or jQuery, all these kind of ways of doing AJAX calls. So there's these sort of basic HTTP protocol, hypertext protocol systems that in the HTMX opinion, or maybe in Carson's opinion, or that are incomplete in HTML. So I think my understanding of the goal has been to um, provide some of those and make hypertext and hypermedia kind of a more viable and more complete solution for just HTML. Does that sound kind of make
Yeah,
does
that's
that sound right?
perfectly accurate. In fact, I would go a step further in that HTMX is really trying to solve the problems with hypermedia in 1999. Like, if you could go back in time, it's solving that problem, and it's solving it in a pretty robust way. And the difference comes into the details and into implementation, and also like a style of coding that's just a different style. Like, it's not to say that that's wrong. It's for example, I think forms are a HTML got a lot of things right, but forms are wrong. And in that, they basically you have a bunch of stuff that's done at a very uh, flat level. And if you're doing nested forms or kind of more complicated things, the idea of like a JSON object and tying that to a form is a nightmare. And there's literally no reason for that to happen. It's one of those. There's certain things that we can't go back and fix, and I think HTMX is a trying to fix what was already there, as opposed to like, hey, we can do this in a better way.
Gotcha. I mean, yeah, I'll just forms as a longtime developer. Just on the basic level, not being able to put a form within a form or the kind of confusion that happens along with that. And, everybody knows kind of the way forms work nowadays. They need to be dynamic. You're not just creating a set of inputs and clicking submit and waiting for the response. You're doing lookups, you're doing validations, you're doing checks. So you see HTMX as kind of, working at that level. The goal there has been to kind of fix problems like that.
Well, in fact, I think part of the talk that I gave was basically saying, hey, I may disagree with the way that things are done in HTMX, but I think the best thing that can possibly come out of it is the triptych proposals, which are basically let's fix buttons and links and other things to be like at least useful in the way that they should be. I think
Yeah.
if nothing else, HTMX slowly fading away because things like the proposal are in place is a good thing for everyone. I think Carson would agree with that. Is that like over time, HTMX should be able to get smaller and smaller because it's very much the same things that happened with CoffeeScript um, a while ago, where all the good ideas of CoffeeScript basically went into ES6. So the hope is that things like CoffeeScript don't exist because like you don't need it because it's built into the standard. I feel like a lot of the things that HTMX provides should already be there. So it's not. I'm more focused on the farther reaching things of like what hypermedia can do as opposed to what hypermedia has done, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
No, okay. So you have piqued my curiosity here. So I don't know, was your talk focused on things that hypermedia can do, or was it, what was it focused on?
Yeah, so the kind of the gist of the talk is I actually been doing. I'm now officially a graybeard. So
Hey, welcome to the
yeah,
club
I know
here.
it's great. So I've been doing this stuff for probably about a little over 25 years, and so I've never seen myself as a JavaScript or a front end guy. I originally started as a 3D artist, and then started writing more and more tools for my own stuff because I couldn't get programmer to help me. So I started writing plugins and started getting into. So I actually came from it from like a C and C++, then Python because that helped interact with tools a little quicker. So I kind of came from the game dev side of the world. And then slowly over time, I found that a lot of people aren't doing full stack. They really don't understand the UX and design stuff, and not just front end and back end, but like really understanding the whole product. So that's kind of how I've always come to solve problems. And so I drank the spa Kool-Aid heavy because that's the way I got things done. And I've done some pretty crazy projects in that space with real-time things handling millions of updates a second, like crazy things. And I basically, the whole talk was me saying, I think we've all got it wrong, especially me. Like by ignoring what hypermedia is and what could do, we've missed the train on what's possible in hypermedia. But at the same time, another part of the talk, it's basically me just yelling, old man yelling at clouds, is saying, I think HTMX is wrong too, because it's not so much the library, but it's the way that people are using it and the way that it's being explained. Because it's seen as a diametric opposition, like React versus HTMX. And the problem is, I think both of them are wrong for different reasons. And that's
Hmm.
basically what the talk was about.
Interesting. Okay. So actually, let me just ask about the game dev and 3D stuff for a second. So like I've always, I've done some 3D work as well, a little bit of game stuff. And I've always thought it was just strange how the game development world has these problems that they've solved that's like thousands of people concurrently, playing with millisecond response times at the same time over this. And I'm here in the web development world and I'm solving, five people working on a team seeing the same thing within a couple seconds. Like it's just like the scale of the expectations and, I don't even know what that is because I felt like I was pretty decent at both, but somehow it just feels like the game development world is on another level in terms of how they're accessing data and storing things. I don't even know what the difference
Yeah.
is, even though I've done
Well,
both.
and this is kind of one of the things that was interesting at the talk. I was talking, in the side room and stuff, and I was going, yeah, I like this stack. It's kind of a higher level stack. It's Go and Datastar and Nats working, and they're like the idea that I think Go is a very high level, like easy, almost a scripting level thing. People were laughing because like that's so much faster than what I'm used to. It's like it's orders of magnitude faster, and it's 30 times less memory than a Node app, for example. They just don't. I don't think people are aware of what computers are capable of. And the thing is, I think they blame like they think that hypermedia is the part that's the problem. But the thing that's kind of insightful, I think, for most people is there's nothing faster you can do in a browser than send the C++, what's called turbofan, the part that actually takes your code and turns it into like C++ classes and does all that kind of stuff. There's nothing faster than handing it a big string of HTML. Like it is built for that idea. And so the more you just send it strings, the irony is the faster your code's going to be. Um, and I think that's lost on a lot of people when they get into the weeds and really understanding what it's capable of. Like when I'm doing stuff in hypermedia, I did it. There was a example that was on Reddit a little while ago where someone made a snake game in HTMX, and they're like showing, "Wow, look at this! This is like 10 frames a second." And I said, I think I could do it a little bit better than that. And I was in the microseconds for updates. In fact, you can go. I found out that you cannot send to a browser faster than its micro task updates because it basically falls over. So you can break the browser with trying to update too fast. So you can do this stuff in microseconds, not just milliseconds. And there's a lot of
So
capability we're leaving on the floor.
so I guess what do you mean by that? I mean, are you talking like is this sockets specifically or like I guess I'm just like big picture, I'm thinking of sending an Ajax request is kind of my baseline for what I'm thinking of. And I don't do a lot with sockets just because I've found them unreliable, I guess. And maybe that's
I
just my understanding of it,
No,
but
100%. One of the things with sockets that is really hard, because I've done some pretty big military applications using sockets, is that you are completely, it's basically you're paying that handshake for every, so you can't just open them up willy-nilly. You have to like open them up. There's a handshake that happens. You make that connection, and if it goes away for any reason, you're on your own. If you have any
yeah.
kind of state, you're on your own. If you all of a sudden have a complex set of connection points, you have to do multiplexing on your own. You have to do routing on your own. You have to do all these things yourself, and then they don't interact with cookies or any of these other things. So it's a completely different paradigm, and it's basically do a bunch of setup, get a raw socket, good luck. And there's value to that, but the problem is with the way the modern connections are, especially with firewalls and all that kind of stuff, the web is not built with that in mind. So you're playing against the grain. Whereas what I'm basically, so Datastar itself, I know we haven't really talked about Datastar specifically, but Datastar is just a library that's 300 lines long. And all it's doing is taking things that, making it so you can do your own declarative plugins and turning that into little snippets of JavaScript. And you sprinkle these in place. In fact, it originally started as an HTMX port to be more modular. That's literally all it was. It's me trying to make HTMX modular so you can pick and choose things. And so with the way that I did my stuff, because I work in real-time dashboard and real-time event stuff, where things can be coming from millions of different places, literally millions. And the thing that I did there is I made every single thing a SSE event. And server-sent events, the thing is people think that they're like a WebSocket, but they're not. They're just a regular HTTP get. And in my version, there's post, patch, put, delete. So you have all the verbs. And,
Yep.
and all you're doing is you're setting a header at the beginning saying, hey, this is an event stream, and I may send down 1 or 0, 1, or a million updates. So when you do the equivalent of HX get, I can do an entire UI with millions of things going on and have one single get open. And then I can change any part of the page at any point. So it's kind of like an out of bound, but it literally is doing it at any point in time. So you can have these things being changing at any point of the screen, and it's dead easy. Same thing happens with a post. So for example, when you do an HX post, you're getting back a response, right? And it's going to update some fragments.
Yep.
What if, for example, you're filling out a form and you're saying, hey, this form now affects 10 different agencies or 20 different microservices in the backend, and I want to know the current state of all those things in a flow. Well, I can get that information instantly and know exactly which server is hitting and all that stuff. So I can be updating the page while that response is still coming in flight. So I can start updating the page immediately as opposed to waiting for a response. So my big thing is that I think HTMX's style of polling made sense in 1999. It makes zero sense today because we have things built into the browser like SSE that automatically does reconnect, automatically can do event tracking, can do all these smart things. Why aren't you guys using this?
All right. So you gotta educate me a little bit on this,
Sure,
because now I'm
absolutely.
starting to just feel kind of ignorant about it. Okay,
Well,
so
and that's the thing.
SSE.
Yeah, so server send events. So you know how when you send down a bit of content, like you send an HTML fragment, your server, whatever language you're in, you're sending down an application or a content. I forget the text-HTML, right? Is the content type.
Yep.
And then you start sending down the content, and then you close that connection, right? Like that's what's happening at the server level.
Yep.
So what an SSE event is, you're saying I'm setting the content type to text-event stream. Okay, that's the type. And then what happens is there's a little protocol that's just like you send it the event colon and then the event type, and then you send like an ID, and then you send the data. And then you send a double new line. You now know the entire SSE spec. So you just keep doing that until you close the connection. So you can send, so instead of wait, and then have you ever done something with a console where you basically want to update the console and then you have to write flush? I don't know if you've ever done. So it's the same kind of thing. You're just saying to the network driver that say, hey, the content isn't completely ready yet, but I want to start sending events immediately. I want to send this chunk to the person immediately. But that chunk is a complete message. So you're just giving it chunks of the response as you have them. So that's the entire spec. It's just a text-based spec using some new lines, and you just send down things. So in the case of Datastar, you can send down fragments like you can in HTMX, but you can also send down direct signal effects. So you can actually affect. Datastar has the concept of reactive signals as a kind of a default thing. So you can do everything you can do in Alpine, everything you do in HTMX. it's less code, it's smaller, and it's faster.
So this is a fascinating use of hypermedia to me, because one of the big problems that I have and that I see as like one of the reasons I'm kind of bullish long term on hypermedia is that once you have this virtual DOM in place, which is every single one in my, even the ones that I like of these sort of front end frameworks, you have to maintain a separate virtual DOM. And then you're usually updating that, with JSON. It doesn't really make sense to just take text and HTML and pop them up there. And so the effect of this is a few things. You have to have the full data really before you start messing with adding stuff to the DOM. And that just adds up over time. In memory, it adds up in slow thing, it slows things down, and it stops you from doing what you've been able to do from the 90s, which is go to a gigantic page of data and immediately see the first lines, because that's what HTML can give you. And I think, they've moved so much into the virtual DOM that it's basically impossible. And this, what you're talking about, the SSE, I mean, this sounds like maybe it's already sort of doing that, and I haven't really been paying attention. When you go to a page and it starts streaming the data, it shows you the HTML and it's still coming in. So maybe this has sort of already been happening. I just haven't really been thinking about it like that. But I mean, this gives you the option for just a whole nother, what you're describing is kind of a whole nother level of speed also.
Yeah, from a framework perspective, I have an essay on the Datastar site of like, hey, I'm going SSE all the way, because before it was in HTMX, it's an extension. In fact, originally Carson and I talked about like fixing the extension, but the thing is, I have like there's a bunch of invariants and stuff in the way that the extensions were built, at least back then, that I'm not smart enough to figure out. I don't think of myself as a JavaScript developer. That's why you'll like, in fact, one of the big arguments that you saw in the HTMX community, there's an entire channel devoted to me saying, hey guys, like I'm running into issues. I don't understand what's going on. And I rewrote the entire thing in TypeScript just to get some idea of the invariants and the types and stuff. And yeah, that was not accepted as even an alternative, like an option. But I found a bunch of errors and things, and I actually started porting it into the Datastar way of doing things. And I found that, a lot of this is you get into tag explosion with the way HTMX works. Like, for example, like it used to be just HX post, HX get, and like HX vowels maybe. Like there wasn't that many or HX on kind of thing. But as it's been, because it's been around for quite a few years now, and you're just getting more and more tags. Whereas I think you're starting to have to learn more and more, which is good for your podcast, right? Like there's more stuff to learn. But in the case of Datastar, there's a total of 11 tags possible so far, and I've only used 2 or 3 for entire real-time applications. It's just not necessary, because once you have reactive signals and you think of it at a like more of a first principles thing of like, what do I have to do on the page and how can I make that declarative? It changes the game quite a bit.
Okay, so let me just try to think how this is working. So this is data-star.dev, right? If people
that's
want to
the
check
website.
it out.
It's literally just taking the data dash attributes. It's literally called data dash star in the spec. And you're just taking things that you would have to write by hand and making it so that it's easy to write plugins to do the same thing as Alpine's doing, or do the same kind of thing as HTMX doing, or be able to plop in web. Like it's basically a way to make everything declarative. That's really all it's doing.
So let me get specific here, because you're talking about sort of replacing different tags because they're no longer needed. So I mean, just kind of a regular thing that I might do is have an HX get with a target and a swap, like a type of swap. So I want to replace the whole target, for instance.
Yep.
Okay, now let's get more. So I'll go a little. So like the swap is, now I'm forgetting the names of them, but after
we can go directly off of that. There's enough to go off of there to tell you the difference between HTMX and Datastar. At least again, these are plugins that are kind of the default right now. You could mix and match any plugins you want, but the ones that I ran into are the ones that are the default right now. So for example, if you did what's triggering that? Is it an on click? Is it getting online? Is it like what do you want? You want to be an HX like click?
Let's make it when it shows up on the screen, or when the page loads, whichever one kind of makes sense for you.
So we have there's a data dash on plugin, right? So it does all the things that are built into the browser. So if you have like online and offline and sync, there's a bunch of stuff that's built into the browser. So basically all of those are data dash on click, data dash on key down, all that kind of stuff. So there is a couple of special ones. There's one called data dash on store change. So if your signals, like if something in your signal changes, you can trigger off that. And there's also a data on load. So you do the same thing of data on load, and you put in there and you say basically, in this case, it'd be $get, and then you do the endpoint. And the $$ just means that it's a sandbox action. So it's not running eval on these commands. It's actually a sandbox function constructor. Same thing that Alpine does. In fact, I looked at their code. It's brilliant. I just wanted to expose it so anybody could add their own actions easily. So you just go do an action. You don't put the target. You don't do any of that because I think that that's wrong. And the reason why I think it's wrong is because the server is going to know exactly what to do with that page. And depending on what's going on, you might be updating multiple parts of the page. So when you do an SSE event, part of the response back is, here's the fragment, and here's where I want it to change on the page. And here, the morphing and all that stuff happens from the server side, because I think that putting it into the thing is fine if you're doing polling. But as soon as you get rid of polling and you say, the server's in charge of what's going to get updated on the page, that's the thing. Those are the kinds of differences where I think I just disagree with HTMX, is that should come from the server side. That should nothing to do with your templating at all.
Okay. So, well, just like logistically, how do you say on your server where it's going? Are you matching IDs?
So yeah, in general, you tend to do IDs, but you can have basically part of that, because when you get a SSE event, you have an event type, and then you have data. Well, on the data lines, you can have, I have a thing called selector, and you can say what what area of the page you want to update. So it can be any kind of query selector that you want. And if you leave that off, it uses the ID of the fragment. So most of the time you just leave that off and you get the ID of the fragment. And you can say how you want to morph is another data line. And you can say, I want it to use append after, replace, all that kind of stuff. But also my stuff comes with idiomorph as the default, which I know you did a talk with Carson not too long ago where he's like, I really wanted to add it in, but it's like too big and it's too crazy. Yeah, I added it in because it's the right answer. So it uses idiomorph. So if you just send a fragment down and it has an ID, it already knows where on the page to update, and it already is going to use morph and do all the right things. So your actual snippets are smaller and more elegant, and you don't have to unless you're appending to a list or deleting an item, that's it. You basically almost never need any of the other tags. They're completely useless in my mind, because if you build your stuff correctly, you don't need to do any of that work. You have the mental model of I'm updating this ID, and it automatically is going to morph and do all the right things.
So it almost sounds like, and we actually did, we mentioned this a little bit, talking about with Carson, like idiomorph, but also, HX swap OOB, which really, this does sound like the mental model of you're basically doing HX swap OOB as your primary, form of communication and updating. Does that sound?
And I think that's accurate, and that's what you should be doing. Because the thing is, as you get into more complicated apps, especially one of the places where that Datastar is getting used right now, there's a military project, and what's interesting about that is they actually are interacting with an old school Ember app, and that is a really hard thing to do, to add something new in and try to fix that. So what they're doing is it's incredibly good as a brand in brownfield. As long as they can get an ID to anything on the page, it doesn't matter if it's an Ember app or not, they can directly affect that thing, because all their templating and all their stuff was done in Ember. But great, so I can do my updates and hook right into their stuff. So I think what's considered out of bounds is the wrong, because that's treated as a special flower in HTMX, and I think that's completely wrong. And part of that is it makes total sense if you're doing polling and you're sending down whole big fragments at a time, as opposed to updating any part of the page at any time. So I'm glad to see that the talks are there, but it's already been solved and it's already done, and it's smaller than HTMX.
Right. So, okay. So what is like I'm just trying to get a full picture here. Maybe we can find an example of we could just use a dashboard, because that sounds like, you're working with real-time dashboards. This is kind of a really good use case of this, where you have different data on the page. So you would have, and what's your primary backend language? Go, you said?
Yeah. So a friend is very cheeky at work and has made a website called gonads.net.
Yeah.
So it's Go, Nats, and Datastar. I think that combination is absolutely a powerhouse because all of them are built with reactivity in mind and performance. And I think it's a good blend of performance to ease of use. Um, I love C, but it is harder to get right. So I think that's a good combination that's really event driven and push based as opposed to pull based, which is what most people think of when they think of hypermedia. They think of polling constantly. And I think that that's just a misunderstanding of what it's capable of.
Okay, so you would, build templates with your sort of, primary well, first of all, do you build a shell and just push that up and then sort of open the connection and then start pushing stuff from
Yeah,
the server?
most of the time, what I'll do is basically, yeah, do that initial page load, which is just a regular, HTTP thing. And the first thing on it is data on load. Go get all like set me up with updates, and then I'll literally update the entire page, including adding and removing non-modal UIs on the fly. So, yeah.
And are you sort of opening one single connection that's like this is the connection that's basically going to stay open, or is it kind of like you keep it open until you push that update and then you maybe like is there some sort of opening of new connections, or how does that generally
So
work?
you can use Datastar exactly like you use HTMX, but I tend to believe it really heavily in the CQRS style, and I don't know if that's a term that you're familiar with.
I
It's
don't
command
know.
query responsibility segregation. And all it's saying is that, look, your writes are completely different than your reads. Because you might have a write that goes and does 20 different things and it may affect this view. So if I'm doing a 3D engine, it'll affect the 3D view, but it also could have an entirely different view that is just an SVG that's, the current mini map or something like that. So the idea is you're separating your writes from your reads. And in the case of dashboards, I tend to have one open connection that basically is sending the updates that hooks into the event bus of the backend. So I can get stuff from literally a million different places, and then I can queue that up and then decide to send down a fragment or send down things at piecemeal. But the whole idea is when I send commands, it doesn't matter if that command came from the browser from a button click or from a new event in the event bus or from the command line doing a bunch of testing. It doesn't matter all the events, it's going to update the page independently. And that talk was doing a lot of that kind of stuff, where I was literally updating hypermedia at 144 frames per second and sending down every single element of an entire 3D scene with thousands of things going on in real time, and it was taking 2% of the CPU. So, like, there's
Wow.
capabilities here that I just don't think people are aware of, and that's my whole thing. Is I want to pay it forward so people are aware that you can do this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say like I'm not aware of this at all. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to, you were talking about pushing the boundaries of hypermedia.
Yeah.
And I'm very interested in pushing the boundaries because there's people who kind of don't think hypermedia can handle drop downs, I mean, it's like, I'm
Yeah.
just kind of like, obviously that's wrong, but like,
Right.
I see it online all the time. Like,
Well, and there's another example that came up. One actually, because we both went to the Big Sky conference,
right.
and we didn't run into each other. But one of the interesting ones that really ground my gears. In fact, I talked to Nate for quite a while after the thing. We had dinner that night at the after party. Was he did a talk with another person, John, that was abusing hypermedia, and it was saying,
Right.
"Here's all the things you should
That was
never."
fun. Yeah.
No, it wasn't. That's the thing is I actually got really upset by it, and then not for the reason that you think is that I think it's the first thing he said is things that you should never do with hypermedia. This is stupid, and that's the fun of it. But my thing is things you should never do with HTMX because the things that he thinks are a joke are things that I'm doing at orders of magnitude higher volume than he is already. Like I've been doing it for at least a year of using it for those kinds of things. So doing a Flappy Bird is not a problem.
Interesting.
Doing things in microseconds is not the issue. So I actually not take offense, but I think that people are
umbrage.
Yeah, I take umbrage to it because the thing is, I see that the HTMX community is possibly going down the same route of SPAs, of not understanding the underlying technology and not understanding its place, and they're going to get themselves into a bad place where like people are going to throw out the baby with the bathwater. These great ideas of hypermedia and having Helios and all these ideas, and they're equating it to bad performance and polling, and that's just wrong. It's just wrong. So I've joked with Nate in the past on some stuff, but I want to stop that as early as possible, and that's kind of why reaching out and talking and stuff because there's some brilliant things to do here, and has nothing to do with like Ryan Florence saying I can destroy your Spot app or your HTMX app in a few minutes. You can't break a Datastar one if that's like if the intent, because the thing is I'm taking these same ideas of Alpine and all this, I'm just making it declarative. I think the declarative part, we all can agree, is a better way because it doesn't matter where the backend's getting it, it doesn't matter how it gets that, you're getting to a known state and you can render that on screen. Like there's a beauty to that, and I don't want us to lose that beauty for some implementation differences between how Carson does and how I do it.
Yeah. So like big picture, the talk that you're talking about, the way they were doing it was, basically polling, sending, I don't know how many requests per second, but if it works out to 10 frames a second or whatever. So they were just like firing off a bunch of individual Ajax requests and getting the data back and trying to, and so, this on a okay network, like they sort of showed like, okay, you can sort of do that and the game is somewhat playable, but obviously you should never do that. So your approach to that would be to set up your screen, set up your game, have your shell there, open a connection that goes to the event, essentially to an event bus, and maybe we can describe what the event bus is a little bit. But you basically plug into the event bus. From your server side, you've got some sort of engine running that is taking in the inputs. So I'm not sure exactly how those inputs are sent in your setup. But
just
it's
regular post and patch. It just sends back an SSE event. That's it. So it's just a normal put patch.
So each one of those doesn't need to sort of create its own. I mean, those could just be regular, open and closed kind of events because you already have your main event that is kind of overseeing the whole process. As you fire things, you're just hitting into the event bus on the server. The server has its own stuff running. It's like a game engine essentially. And it's taking in those inputs, which come in fast because usually, the distance for so if the connection doesn't need to be open, like, do you have a separate connection open for the inputs too, or do each of those kind of go on its own in your ideal setup?
So in my ideal setup, those are completely, and the thing is you can send multiple requests with a fetch, right? Like they're just completely independent. It's just a normal HTTP call, but it's using SSE. That's it. Like it's just a different style. And if you send it back, nothing but the header saying, hey, this was the content type and it's blank, then you're done. So you have one way to learn to do things. So you have that ability. And the nice part about it is one of the things that I think a lot of people lose is that worst case, it's twice as fast. And the reason why is because you're making a poll, then waiting for that connection and going back and forth every single time. I can send an update directly, which means that the round trip time is halved. By definition, it can be already twice as fast. So even if that frame rate, which you were showing, was like 13 frames a second, even if you did the exact same thing I was doing in HTMX, it would be 24 or 26 frames a second. Like before you even gets into making it better and doing things like updating signals as opposed to fragments and all, like there's a bunch of things that I think they were doing wrong in that example. But the point is just thinking about it at a deeper level, you could do this in HTMX. And I'm not saying not, but the style of how you build things is so much more complex in HTMX to do the same thing that it's more code and it's less performant. Because in general, more code is like doing stuff in game dev, the special secret sauce is do less things per frame. Like be smart about what you do per frame. So do less code is faster code.
Yeah. And I think Carson, from talking to him, would agree with you on that. I think he's agonized over adding anything to the HTMX code base, but the way that it's set up, where you're handling most of your stuff from the front end, rather than sort of handling it all from the server end, you do end up needing more attributes. You need some more things like that.
But here's the kind of the irony of the situation is because with HTMX it's around 14K, right? And that's not including. And I can tell you on Reddit, at least, like a third of all the posts you see are like, hey, how do I do this thing? And it's either add hyperscript or add Alpine or some other thing on top of it. So the actual size of like what you have to learn is really high to do really reactive websites. All of the plugins for all the things that you can completely replace both of those frameworks with is 14K with Datastar. And part of that is because there's a lot of overlap in who owns the main loop, who owns events, how things get triggered, all these things. Like Alpine and HTMX completely disagree on who owns an event and what you do with that data. And by having plugins that understand and rely on each other, and that's where a lot of the Datastar stuff is about creating plugins that know about each other and know that one has to exist before I can do my stuff. That kind of thing. Like that's what the 300 lines is all about. It's like, hey, how do I make plugins be really aware of their surroundings so that I don't have to think about it ever again, right? I can just write declarative code and go about my day. It ends up being smaller, a lot smaller. And even though there's 14K of it, most of that over, like right around half of it is idiomorph and a fetch thing from Azure and a couple things around signals. So over half the code is just outside, like me just trying to build the bits and pieces to make that declarative. That's it. Like it's using the idiomorph. It's using, so the actual size of the thing is minuscule and it's less to learn. That's the thing that I think it's kind of missing, because everyone in the HTMX community is like, hey, this is so much easier to learn than SPAs. And the irony is, I think Datastar is easier to learn, especially when you get to day 2 and month 2 problems, than HTMX is. I think HTMX starts to explode as you get more and more endpoint, because you have to make a million endpoints to try to hook into your HX gets and to all these different pieces. With my way of doing it, you have one endpoint, you're done. Like you're done most of the time. And then you send commands depending on what you want to do. And that could be one endpoint. It could be multiple depending on what the structure of your stuff is. So it's way less code and it's way easier to learn. And you get real time for free. I'm not saying every app has to be real time, but you get that out of the box for free. So it can probably handle your basic stuff really well too.
Okay, yeah. So 2 questions on that. I guess the first one is in this kind of SSE connection, like how is it handled? You know, I still am like mentally thinking of this as almost like a WebSocket. Like there has to be some break. Like what happens if it breaks? What happens if your server can no longer send something? How do you know when does that happen? You know, because I mean, I lose internet connection every now and then. Sometimes I'm on my phone, stuff like that. So yeah, how is that usually handled?
The nice part about SSE as a spec is that it automatically handles reconnect for you. It's already part of the spec. So as soon as you lose connection, it just reconnects. And in fact, it reconnects and says, hey, I was on this, because you can put an ID on your events. So you can actually say, hey, I sent down event 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then say, hey, I reconnected. Last thing I saw was 3. And you could automatically send down 4 and 5. Like, oh, there's all these kinds of parts of the spec of SSE. It just does this automatically. And it's just normal HTTP. There's nothing special about it. Like the way you're like, hey, do I have to open up a bunch of connections? Like if you click on 3 things on a to-do, fire off 3 different events. They're going to happen asynchronously. They're going to get resolved separately. Like it doesn't matter. You're going to get to the same eventual consistency. So it is truly easier than you. Most of the time I spend on the HTMX. We're in the HTMX Discord and we have our own little channel. But most of the time I'm trying to tell people you're overcomplicating it. You're making it harder than it needs to be.
Right.
And that's really where I spend most of my time because it's been pretty stable for the last year.
Interesting. Okay. So, and then the other piece you mentioned was, you know, you end up with a bunch of endpoints with HTMX, and this is a pain point that I would say I've encountered as well. I started with Laravel Livewire. Have you used that one before?
I'm very familiar. In fact, I tried to make a Go version of it, and the thing is, I thought it's a really brilliant idea. I mean, you have to really commit into Laravel to use Livewire. But also the problem is it's trying to keep the state between the front end and back end in sync. It's a syncing tool more than it is a like logical thing of the server's in control. It really is trying to keep the sync in place, and I think it's very easy to get desynced with it. And I ran into the exact same issues with the Go version. I went down that route. I've gone down to a lot of routes before. I decided like having my own JS framework is the farthest from meet an ideal situation in my mind. But it's so small that it's very easy. Like I'm happy to maintain it. But I've tried that way, and it is fraught with good intentions. But it's still just WebSockets, and you have all the issues you have with WebSockets on top of it.
Well, okay, wait. So Livewire isn't WebSocket. Livewire ended up they started with WebSockets and switched to. So nowadays they use just Ajax request and stuff like that.
Okay, well, that's good news because when I used it was WebSockets. So
yeah, Phoenix Live View was the WebSocket one. That's all WebSockets.
Oh, that's right. Right. Sorry, you're right.
But yeah, anyway. But Livewire, one of the issues with Livewire that I've had is it is keeping that virtual DOM. It does have to, like you said, it has to. It even has one of the funniest things. One of the commands you can use is entangle, which like just that word. Every time I come across that, I'm like, oh, this is not a good word for me.
No,
that's one of the last things I want to see in my code is an entanglement.
One of my favorite words in the world is complecting, which means to braid together. Um,
Complecting.
yeah,
I've
complecting.
never heard
It's
that. Yeah.
because people tend to complect things together. They actually make it braid it, and make it more complicated and tangled, basically, when they don't need to. So complecting
Yeah.
is like the tangling on purpose, I guess.
Yeah. So okay. So I like I like a lot about Livewire. I'll say the thing I really like about Livewire, and the reason I would still use it in some projects, especially if they're new projects, the fact that it doesn't go into old projects is a problem. But what they do is, your mental model of what's happening. You don't need to think about routes. You don't need to think about endpoints. You don't need to think about particular code snippets. It's like you have this one single component, and then on the back end in your PHP code, you're deciding what happens with that based on logical things and updates and actions and stuff like that. So removing that kind of now that I've sort of switched to HTMX for most of my stuff, I am finding that you can't keep that sort of, like, I often would reach for, I almost want this section, this whole widget to just, whenever I make changes, this is the thing that's getting updated, and I don't necessarily want to have to say, okay, there's this, this small part and this big part and all these things. I just want to mentally think of this. I don't want to set up 5 routes for it. I just want to mentally think of this as a single component. And so that's something that's kind of tripped me up about a little bit. But when you're talking about Datastar and how you don't really have to think of endpoints and you don't have to sort of create these different ones, ultimately, I mean, there's a certain amount of logic that you can't ignore. Like, you still have to, for instance, have, it's maybe not an endpoint, but something has to update and go to the right place. So somewhere in there, you're still doing that work, right? Of like, when this is clicked, I need to handle it in a certain way and send back this particular data. Is that true? Or are you basically building the page every time in full and then sending it, with essentially an OOB swap? Like, what's the sort of like, what's your sort
Yeah,
of
what's the mental
way that you
model?
think about that?
That's a great question. I should actually let my cat out of the room because it's going to
Yeah,
start
yeah, no
crying.
worry.
Give me 1 second.
Yep, no worries.
So it's a great thing, and this was part of the talk as well. One of the final revelations I had, that I don't know why it took me so long to do this. A better game developer would have thought of this immediately. But there's a style of doing graphical interfaces in game dev. There's called retain mode and immediate mode. I don't know how familiar you are with these concepts. The idea of a retain mode is very much the OOP style of, I have a button. It has a on hover, on click, on this. Here's its position. Here's all the state involved with it, and then every frame you take that state and then you basically create the quads or whatever to actually render the pixels. And immediate mode says all of that is useless. And the reason why is because that button may not exist next frame because something else is going on, or there's a cooldown or something else, and you have to know the context of everything else on the screen. Like, let's say you have a scroll bar of buttons. You aren't going to only show so many buttons on the screen in a scroll view, so only worry about the buttons that are available on, like, the offsets that are available now, and just render those quads directly. And it's a much lower level style of doing graphical user interfaces, but at the same time, it's faster and it's easier to write, because instead of trying to keep all this state, you're just rendering what's available at that time. So in my head, SPAs are the equivalent of retain mode, and hypermedia is about immediate mode. So when I go and do things, there's one of the things I did in the talk that I thought was kind of an interesting is I basically rendered every single position of every single thing in a 3D view on every frame, and basically using web components to do that. So you're writing HTML. So I'm writing out thousands of divs every single frame, and then letting Idiomorph and God decide like which things actually got updated. So I did the dumb thing from a performance standpoint to say, look, even when you do the dumb thing and you just hand the entire app as an ID and you just hand it down and let Idiomorph and other things figure out what changed, it's still so damn fast. Like, it's probably fine for most people's apps. Like the front page of there's a to-do app on Datastar front page. I just send down the whole to-do each frame because it's not that much stuff. It compresses very well. It's easy to do, and then you let the morph DOM stuff do the right thing. When you get into a situation from a metrics, because I'm very metrics focused when I'm doing stuff, and so when I see the metrics of like, this is causing this much in bandwidth, we can change this, then get into I want to update parts of the page and do all that stuff. So it has the ability to update things in a very dynamic, independent way. But a lot of times you can just send down the current state of what's on the page and let the morph DOM stuff do the correct thing. Like, don't make it complicated just for the sake of performance. It's already fast enough.
So um, let me push back on that a little bit because one of the there was an argument recently online about it was a performance one. I think it was DHH put up his, maybe you saw this, it was
I
his
can't take
app
him seriously when it comes to performance things because
but the thing is, so and the end result of it was that roughly the average time for a click was 90 milliseconds. And I think people kind of like took him to task for that, like, this is slow. And and there was a lot of these kind of like, my app is handling 10 million requests every minute, and it's like a 5 millisecond response time. And my thought for that was like, the apps that I build, for instance, I don't want, or I would never want to send back the whole thing every time for small things, because it's doing a lot of database querying, and it's doing actually some pretty complex database querying. I do my best to cache things when I can, but like, you've got a lot of different stuff, and if you start to for a full page reload, that's fine. I'm willing to take that hit. And that's what really slows it down, is when there's a lot of people using it. And it's really, right now, I would say the database is that's the problem, that's the main area. Like, if it's something really simple, I would have no problem doing what you're sort of describing, which is just send the whole page over and over again. That's fine. For stuff that I tend to work on, one of the things I've liked about HTMX is that I can make it feel very fast, because even on these kind of complex pages where you're doing 600 database queries to build the whole page, to build the side thing, to build all these different things, you do that once, and then you do 2 database queries for your actual update. So it's like lightning fast. So in that scenario, this is where you're saying you would probably start to look into other things that don't hit the database so much.
Yeah. So this is again, to me, hypermedia is just a tool in the toolbox, in that, like, look, I don't think people realize how much, from the actual hypermedia standpoint, sending down the whole page is not expensive, right? Like, if you're doing a bunch of database stuff,
in terms of HTML, no, right. I totally agree.
Right. So we're dealing with two different issues at this standpoint. Now, what I would say is most people are doing databases wrong. And what I mean by that is I tend to, and I've been doing this for years, and it's finally become a little more popular, which is interesting, because like, I've been doing signals for like 5-6 years, and it's finally, people are seeing it. Same thing with databases. I use SQLite embedded in every single Go app I ever make. And then all of a sudden, your database, you can do n+1 queries, and it costs you basically nothing. It's a function call within your same memory. It's in the same pages. It's all that stuff. So I can do hundreds of calls in a few milliseconds. And so all of a sudden, my queries, I'm not waiting on the database. I can do stuff instantly, so I can send down the whole page. And so even if I'm dealing with Postgres, I still use like SQLite as a local cache of that data, so that I'm not relying on it all the time. So I use it as an optimistic query, even when I have to deal with someone else. But most of the time, people don't realize how many, I deal with SQLite databases into the hundreds of millions of keys in a table, and it works fine. So it depends on if you have total control, right? Like, I know that you do a lot of governmental stuff, and you don't have the ability to choose your database. So you have to break things out. And in that case, 100%, only update the parts of the page that have to update. Only do smart things, but also you're getting into caching and interesting problems, which has nothing to do with hypermedia. I'm opening up the opportunity to say, hey, you can send down the whole page, and it's going to be wicked fast. But if it's your database that's the problem, then it's no longer sending down the whole page makes any sense.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm saying is, though, if you can't send down the whole page every time, or you just sort of don't want to to reduce the CPU usage on your VPS or whatever. So how do you sort of handle that from when you receive a request in general? Like, what would be your go-to for if you did want to just send back a smaller part?
Yeah. So let's say we had a data table on the page that has stuff from the database, right? And you need to update the last two things on the page, got updated or something. Like you're only affecting like three things on the page, right?
Yeah.
So in that case, you'd be sitting down your original data grid, or it'd be part of your initial data of the page. So you'd have table IDs and you'd have row IDs and all these things. So you'd
Yeah.
want to have that be something you can target. And then you would just say, like, when I make this query and it automatically updates things, when I go to send a fragment, I know that I'm going to update this ID and this ID on this row. And you just send those down as two individual elements and you're done. Like you can target them independently and you just send them as two different events right after each other, or you send them down as they get updated. So on each insert that you do into the database, you could be also sending down SSE events as part of that transaction.
Yeah.
So you could optimistically do those updates and if there's any errors, then like revert back to where you were. You can do all these really interesting things because you can start sending down updates during a transaction as opposed to waiting until the end.
That's interesting. So you could, okay. Yeah. So you could, before touching the database, create your object before saving or whatever, and just send back that HTML and then send it again at the end of, your database thing.
Exactly
And
right. In this one of your podcasts, you were talking about like optimistic updates are the end boss for HTMX, and I pushed back and said that's just the beginning. Like that's the starter tutorial for what hypermedia itself is capable of. And I feel like that's where we just disagree, but we all are trying to get to the right thing. That like, hey, I think people are not realizing how good hypermedia is, and when it's not good, my opinion is like then you should be making a native app and doing like actual RPC streaming type stuff. Like the places where it doesn't make sense, spas don't make sense either. You should be doing like a native thing at that point.
yeah. And so, I mean, what you're talking about, like, is it feels kind of light years ahead of where a lot of some of the apps that, in terms of like speed and stuff like that, and kind of the ability to update things immediately. It does feel quite a bit ahead of kind of, just sort of the general, which I would probably do right now is poll every 5 seconds because, people don't really, in my mind, like the stuff I'm working on, people are happy if they are 5 seconds, behind like that's
Right.
enough for the stuff that I'm doing.
Okay. So here, I'll give you an example of one of the projects I'm really proud of. It ended up with a software patent, which I'm not a big fan of, but it makes sense in this case. I was doing a project where we were tracking every radar station in the continental United States, every single radar blip from each of those stations, and having it live inside of a browser within 700 milliseconds from anywhere in the continental United States. So you need to be able to look at over 800,000 points per second being updated in your browser in real time. And then had the ability to scrub back to any point in time over the last hour over that data. So that had a 5 millisecond window to scrub that data. So
Wow.
I'm used to dealing with like hard. I think pushing to me the browser is a beautiful thing for a sandbox to do interesting things in because everyone has it. Everyone has auto updates. Like it's a platform, and I think that the SPA people and now the HTMX people are just talking past each other on like what is capable in these machines. And I do think having a different mentality coming from a game dev and not being a JavaScript or TypeScript person, but just like to me, it's a tool to get the job done. I just have a different outlook of like what is capable and what I don't understand why people are having such a hard time making a fast web form. Like there's still the issue if you go the hypermedia route. This is just a default thing of if you're updating a to do and you're going to the server for that validation, you're still going to have those requests. Like there's still that cost. But if that to do is now shared between you and 1,000 people, you've amortized that cost of that one interaction across all the other interactions that are happening live. So for certain kinds of things like web forms, it may feel slower, but you're always guaranteed to be in the right state. And you could do optimistic updates to make it look like you're, like you have data, but you're not in the same state as the rest of the system. So I think there's things there that are an interesting dichotomy of like what the user expects. Like if the user expects that my changes will get automatically synced to the server, that's different than saying, I know I'm always in a safe state. I know I'm always, if I can see it on my screen, it's correct with what the server's going to see. I'm never going to get into a bad situation.
Yeah, and we sort of talked about this. I talked about this with Carson with optimistic UIs, where it's like, do you even want an optimistic UI all the time? Like, if it tells you did something and you didn't, you have to put some work in to say like, okay, this is not finalized yet or something like that. because otherwise you are misleading people, or you're giving them buttons that are not going to work, which you don't
Well,
want to do
even when
that
it comes,
either.
yeah, even when it comes to things like game dev, you have things what's called netcode, where you're basically you have to do dead reckoning and stuff. Like if you're playing a first-person shooter and you're shooting at someone, you're shooting at where they were before, and you have to do the reconciliation and checks to see that you basically not only are shooting at that person, but also if all of a sudden the server says you were wrong, you have to actually go back in time and replay those events and basically tween between them so that it looks smooth to you, whether you hit them or not. Like, and I
Is that
think the
how
thing
that
is,
works? I
yes,
mean, like
that's
this is shocking to me
no,
coming
this
from
is
a web
literally
development that this is possible. That when I play these online games, I'm like, how are they doing this?
well, yeah, it's called net. We can get into a whole talk of that. Actually, Blizzard has a great talk about netcode that I can link to you. But the point is that as soon as you start doing optimistic updates in the way your thing, I'm talking about like as soon as you get to the server, sending back a like your thing got approved. Oh wait, we ran into an issue, right? I think that's a
Yeah.
different level kind of optimistic updates.
Okay.
Whereas if you want to get into the netcode style, you are in for that's all of what an FPS is about. Is like how to reconcile like what is actually happening with what you want the user to see and to make it feel like a smooth transition. And I don't think any web app I've ever used that would be a good idea because you're talking about someone's like bank credentials. I don't want to have a tweened version of whether I was
Yeah.
logged in or whether my account.
Probabilistic. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that's a bad idea for what the web is. While I still am working on some interesting things with web transport to do like an FPS type shooter type style, the same thing is that all that logic would live inside of web components. It would not be driven by HTMX or Datastar, like from that point of view. And that's one thing I did talk about in the talk is I really believe in web components now in a way that I thought they were dumb and stupid not too long ago. And the reason is because if you're doing all your stuff in a spa, breaking it out into a web component doesn't make any difference. Why do I care if I can use this in React? I'm already using it in Vue or whatever, right? Like, it doesn't make any sense. But as soon as you say, I'm going to keep all the state internal and I can drive it from anywhere or from anything, then things like I built a 3D engine as a web component. That's great because I can keep the state internal inside there, but then drive it with Datastar. So I can drive any attribute on any element. So web components to me is about making new elements. Datastar is about driving existing elements in every one of their attributes. So it's a different way of thinking about the problem. You're not getting rid of JavaScript. You're putting you're keeping state in the right place because there's always that dichotomy between you want separation of concerns for higher order components, but you want locality of behavior inside of that component. So I think you have to think about this stuff at a deeper level to get the value of it. And I just feel like the hypermedia, which is basically HTMX right now. Like Datastar doesn't have its own Discord. Like everyone that cares about this stuff is in the HTMX space. But I feel like
Right.
they're missing the forest for the trees and like what hypermedia itself is about. And it's almost like the Roy building thing happening again. That people are missing the boat on what the possibilities are and just focusing on this implementation.
Interesting. So, I mean, the big picture is like the SSE concept. Like that doesn't exist in HTMX. Is that fair to say? I mean, they
It
use an
exists
extension,
as an
right?
extension, but it's to me it was such a fundamental core idea that I started mucking into the 4K of HTMX to try to like add these kinds of features and add some Alpine like features, and I got just into the weeds. Like it's just not. I'm
It's
not
not
smart
set
enough to
up for
understand
that.
the consequences of making extensions. I'm not smart enough to understand the consequences in HTMX. And same with Alpine. So both of them are just a JavaScript. Like HTMX is a 4K file that is a edifice to Carson's brain. And while I think it's a beautiful and wonderful thing to be there, I don't think it's the rock I want to build my future on.
Yeah, and I mean, let me ask a few questions about sort of some of the background stuff that you've mentioned. So the event bus, let's call it, like I don't do much with events. So, and part of that is because just my sort of my general distaste for my coding in the past when I've used events. It's been very hard to track down, but I'm mostly thinking client side events. So, I have somewhere some jQuery file with 40 different hooks into different events that's going to do different things on click and hover and all. That's my 10 years ago kind of way of thinking about events. And so I've just over time kind of moved away from them. But I recently saw I don't know if you saw any of the Laracon talks, or if you sort of follow any of the Laravel stuff. Well, so one of the big talks was about event sourcing, and how if you just keep a record of your events, you can then basically export that to any sort of front end. You can you can have different database views based on your events that go to different systems, because your events are really the core. This is what your users have done. So that doesn't change, but what does change is what happens because of those events. And so this to me feels a little bit like the game dev example, that the first person shooter. It has to reconcile, but really there is a core. Here's the events that happened, and how that's displayed to the different users might be different, but somewhere in the back they're keeping this sort of immutable record of the clicks that happened, where the user was, where the player was, all this kind of stuff. So is that sort of how you think of an event bus at
Yeah,
all?
I know we don't know a lot about my background, but the thing I was doing, I actually joined Synadia, which is the people behind Nats, which is like the premier way to do event-driven architecture stuff um, on the web. But also before I was doing that, I was working on my own startup that's literally called Event Graph, that is an event sourcing way to build. So I could talk to you for probably 12 hours straight about event sourcing. And it's actually the very first piece of writing we have was cuneiform, that were grain shipment logs, that is literally an event sourcing style. So I've gotten really deep into those weeds. I would happy to talk to you, but I think the problem with event sourcing as a general concept is, once you think about it, you can't get rid of it, because if you're not doing event sourcing, you are losing state by definition. Like there's no way to do everything is just down to implementation details from there. So yes, everything to me is event sourcing, because that allows you to make choices later, and projections are completely independent. So for example, one of the things that you run into both with game dev and with a lot of things is I talk a lot about sources of truth, and really your events are your source of truth. And then things like a index or a relational table is really a projection of what the events that happened. But as soon as you put in an update or delete, you've now lost data. So I think that most databases should be a projection. So it doesn't matter if it's a graph database or a relational or a time series. All of those should be queued off of your events. So yeah, I think about events at a deep, deep level, and everything has to be event-based, which means everything in the end is push-based, which means everything should have push-based as its interface, which means things like Go, things like Nats, things like Datastar. And that's the thing, is I feel like coming at it from a different point of view of like not only what is capable now, but how we should be thinking about things. One of the examples on the Datastar website was this Bad Apple example, which is just it's a music video that gets used for like ASCII art and for benchmarks and stuff like that. And someone brought up like, hey, wouldn't it be funny to see a HTMX example of this? It'd be kind of fun, and be like, oh, why don't you go do it yourself? And I said, huh. And I go looked at the ASCII art, and the actual Datastar part of it took less than 3 minutes. And I had a real-time feedback player of ASCII art. And the thing that's interesting to me about that shouldn't be interesting. I should be able to take this set of events and send them down. There's nothing that should be interesting about that. But in the HTMX community right now, that's seen as like a really cool demo. It shouldn't be. Like this is basic replaying of events to a page, and I should easily be able to do that 30 frames a second. Like that's 330 milliseconds or 33.3 milliseconds. That's an eon for a computer to figure things out, even with the network involved and everything else. Like that initial connection takes time, but the latency for each individual frame should not be high. So it's not a big deal. You can go play it right now, and it's should be buttery smooth on a free tier Flight.io server, wherever it's at.
Yeah, I mean, so this is, I just in general, this is kind of blowing my mind here, because this I'm used to a certain way of browsers taking data in and kind of processing them, and I've been kind of pushing back against the SPA world in my own head and for a long time, because I just really dislike how it has to keep its own huge thing and how slow it gets. Like if you have ever tried to do something like this, which you probably have, if you went deep on it and put, let's say 1,000 examples. So here's something I'll just tell you I'm working on, because I'm going to be talking about it next season, but I'm building right now a page of HTMX examples. And one of the sort of like flex things that I'm going to do with it is I'm going to put hundreds, maybe thousands of examples onto the page that all work, right? Which is like, why would you do that? Who cares? To the SPA world, you literally can't do that. I tried to do this with even with Livewire, which is not exactly an SPA, but because it has to put everything into JavaScript memory, it can't do it. So I feel like the big trick that you're talking about, and like the event sourcing stuff, people don't even know what that is in the development world most of the time. You should check out that talk at Laracon by Daniel Colborn.
Okay.
I'll say this not even just to you because you already don't really need it, but anybody who's listening, his package is called Verbs, and it gives a conceptual idea of why you would use event sourcing and what the purpose of it is. Like just the big picture. What's the purpose of this? And it's exactly what you just described. A month ago, I wouldn't have had sort of a good concept of what that is. Now I sort of do. But mixing that event sourcing, where you're taking this in, and having this kind of game development concept of like, why should the web be slow? They're all computers. You play computer games fast on your computer. Why does the web so slow? Like, I think that mentality mixed with event sourcing, and then just something as simple as a basic HTTP, SSE form, where like SSE way of sort of sending an open. I keep calling it a socket. I don't know what to call it.
Just regular HTTP. It's just HTTP.
So what do you like? What do you call it? And besides SSE, like an open-ended request? Is
Yeah,
that
it's
like
just a request.
okay? So sending an open-ended request, which I don't think I've
Sure.
ever done in my life, and like
Right.
that opens up along with these other tools. I guess that one of the big questions that I would have left, and I know we're already over an hour, so I'll try to keep it brief here. But can you do this with any one of the things I like about HTMX and hypermedia in general, and I'm moving more towards using more browser tools, more browser built-in modals, everything. It's all built in. It's wonderful. And I open these apps that I haven't touched in 7 years. I can throw HTMX at the top, and I'm already building awesome new features for this old app. Can you're using Go? Is there anything specific about the tech that you're using, or can I, as like a Laravel primarily developer, can I do this stuff just as easily?
Yeah, 100%. It works in all of the things. In fact, there's a person that's actively saying, starting to do stuff in Elixir because it matches his mental model of how event input, the way it works with that. So yeah, it's just like HTMX. I think that's one of the brilliant things of what it's doing there. I totally agree that you should be able to do it in anything. In fact, we have a lot of people that are using it in Node, which I hate. Like I think it's the worst backend technology, and yet people are using it and it's making their lives easier, even though they're staying in TypeScript or like they can send down declarative things and let things work themselves out in the front end. So there's nothing magical about it. Everything you can do in HTMX, you can do in Datastar and more. And to be clear, this is just the plugins and the way I like to work. Nice thing about Datastar is you could you could completely rewrite HTMX in Datastar. You can't do the reverse because you can set up these set of plugins. I just think that style. I originally did that. I originally did it all like just literally ported all the tags over, and I was like, this doesn't make sense. For like, I have this capability of doing all these really interesting things. Why would I do it this kind of 1999 style way of doing things? Like I believe that we should get back to hypermedia. I don't think we should get back to 1999, and I think that's the difference between Carson and I's approach to this stuff.
Yep. Okay, so just on the like doing something in the back, using Laravel for something like this. My understanding of how PHP kind of handles a request um, is it does close, it shuts things down at the end. So
Yeah,
how do you stop that from happening? If you need to have kind of a process running on the server that is going to be sending stuff out, that's not in my experience the general way that PHP or Laravel is sort of handling requests. How do you sort of think of that?
I mean, the thing is, I can't speak for the PHP side because I've heard that PHP has gotten pretty good lately. So it's been a while since I've used it. But what I will say, at least in the Node side, because I do know that decently well, is that basically if you have a tight loop, it's just going to sit in that loop. But if you have like, I'm awaiting some event bus for a response or some kind of network thing like NATS or something, then you just update the response. So you can do things concurrently with still being on a single thread. Go has the beauty of being able to do concurrency and multi-threadedness at the same time, so there's a value there. But as long as it's an async thing where you're basically awaiting a subscription, I know in the Go side, for example, you have this idea of a context. So you can check the context done to see if the client closed the connection, or you can just close your handler and that also closes the connection. Like it does, you can handle it both ways. I'm not sure what the equivalent in PHP is. I'm guaranteed there's a way to do it, but basically it's the equivalent of saying, did the user close the connection? Or if I just return, does that close the connection automatically for me? We can get into, I would be happy to work with you to try to figure out what the right way to do that is. But again, if you were using the HTMX SSE extension, you'd run into this exact same issue. Like it's just an issue of having a live connection that keeps open. There's nothing about the PHP, unless they have some kind of weird timeout thing on your handler that says you can't keep a connection open.
I
Like,
mean, it is maybe a little weird, and I don't know without getting into it, but I know that Laravel released kind of a big package. I think they Swool or something, but it was to keep a connection open. It was like a big deal. This was a couple years ago, and I don't know that without that there is a built-in way. So I'd have to do my own sort of looking into that just to kind of like figure that out.
yeah, I'm not sure because there's nothing part of the spec. Like when you say I'm returning a response, unless you have some kind of timeout or something on your actual connection that says, hey, I'm closing connection after a certain amount of time, which is built into Go too, but you basically say, I'm setting up what's called a flusher in the Go response. It's saying that I'm going to start flushing down things immediately. And you send out an initial page with that flusher response. Now all of a sudden it's going to say, I'm going to keep this open forever. So if there isn't, a lot of times I see people use an SSE plugin or something for their backend, but it's literally 4 lines of code. I highly recommend not using the SSE plugin, but just looking at the code of it and saying, what's going on here? Because it should be at most 4 lines of code of saying, I'm setting up the right header, I'm flushing that down. Okay, now I should be good to send either 0 or 1,000,000 events from here. So, yeah, I don't know what the answer is, but there's nothing. The nice part is that even though it's not technically SSE from the client side, from the server side, any SSE library or anything like that will work out of the box. But I highly recommend not using a library because you should just know what it's doing. There's no
Right.
magic. It feels like, and that's the problem I think people see is they think that there's a lot more magic, that it is a socket, that it is this special thing, whereas it's just not. It's just not a special thing. In fact, it's exactly how I do hot reload of my apps. It's like a 4-line thing of basically I go to /hot reload and that SSE event is just it basically opens and never closes, and that's it. Like, and then when the server restarts, it's going to automatically try to redo that connection because it's built into SSE, and then it'll load the page again. Like that's all you have to do to make SSE a hot reloading work.
Yep.
Is just use an open SSE event.
And you write your application, using events so that different events trigger updates and different, some trigger updates, some don't. Is that sort of a big picture how
Yeah.
your sort of apps would be set up?
So if, for example, if I have an open updates, like if we just made a single endpoint that's /updates, right? Let's do it my way. And I
Yeah.
had it, and I'm subscribing to a bunch of things inside of the event bus. In my case, Nats all the time. I would say, oh, I got an update that has to do with user credentials, and that I already know that's I'm gonna have to update their avatar. Okay, well, I just send down update that ID and send down the avatar. But it may be something that says, hey, they changed their billing to be on the 5th of the month instead of the other. And I would just say, cool, and do nothing. Right? I would just like let that thing go. So it's very much there's that switch statement that happens inside of your events of like, hey, I got an event down. What do I do? But it's very much closer to the actor model of handling mailboxes and all that kind of stuff that you would do in Elixir or an Erlang or something like that. You're just responding to the events, and then when you see something that needs to change the page, render that fragment at that moment. So you don't have to wait till the end to do a response like you would in your normal HTMX thing, right? You're sending a response to the end, sending fragments. I can send the fragment literally when it happens. So my code is actually a lot cleaner, and the locality of behavior is even tighter than what you get in HTMX because
All right.
it's directly where I'm doing the work. I just send the SSE event at that moment.
Interesting. Well, no, I mean, this is crazy stuff. I love it. I mean, this is like,
Yeah.
really, it's like, I feel like you are one of the people in that bridge between game dev and web dev, where for some reason there just hasn't been that mentality of being able to do this kind of stuff, and I'm not exactly sure why. I feel like there's a pretty
I
good
fell into the
overlap
same
in
trap
people who do
though.
both.
Yeah,
You what?
I did both, and I fell into the trap of, oh well, obviously I put on my web hat. I'm in web
Yeah.
world. I put on my spa hat. I'm going to be building these giant npm megaliths, um, and it's dumb. It's just dumb. The irony is that I feel much more comfortable in like web GPU and like in drivers and building shaders and stuff. But for some reason, I think there's a mental load of like, well, this is what everybody else is doing, and someone has had to have thought about doing it this way, and there's that model of like I'm not any special. I'm not a JS guy. There's got to be someone who's thought of this already. And I think Carson kind of showed that like some crazy guy in Montana is sometimes needed, and having a guy that's done a little bit of everything from Vegas would be of value because no one has thought about this. Because whenever I show it, people are like, they almost don't believe that there's some kind of vaporware thing
Like,
going
what's
on as
happening
opposed to,
here?
yeah,
Like, yeah, you just running like a WebGL thing, and there's like, it's running in the
well,
browser.
so, for example, I put a thing in the chat of just like just I know it's mostly for radio, but if you click on that thing, you'll see it was one of the first React conferences. They were talking about how React can do things that no other framework can do, and look, it can do this thing at like 30 or 60 frames a second, and there's this DB monitoring tool. And if you click on the link, you can actually see how long I'm actually tracking how long in the Go side it's taking me to do that update, and it's microseconds. Like it's literally microseconds to do the update. So the idea of what is possible and capable, I think the same way React kind of pushed people's boundaries of like, look, like jQuery is a bad way to keep track of all your state. Because if you put more and more state in the front end, jQuery is not the right way to do it. We have a different way, and BDOM's not that bad. Okay, that's cool. But when you say I can tell you the exact state of the entire system and everyone agrees to it in an eventually consistent way, so that everyone's looking at the same data, but they're still able to do it at 90 frames a second. That's a mental model that no one seems to have. And the one thing I will say is that when I've talked to HTMX people about this, they just kind of YOLO about it. Like if I say, hey, I made this thing and it's over 10,000 frames per second when you made it 10, I don't get responses back of like, hey, maybe I'll go look at Datastar or maybe I'll think about this differently. They just go, well, that doesn't track my mental model, and it's about the lulls as opposed to about the actual data and the content. And I'm really fearful of that. In the next 5 years, you're going to see more and more of pigeonholing what hypermedia is to the current implementation. And I don't want to see that because the same thing happened with spas.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you gotta have people pushing the boundaries. I mean, I feel like you are pushing those boundaries. I love it. And
Well, the good thing is you don't, just because you can do this stuff doesn't mean you have, like, you can still use it for just regular basic website stuff. Like, it's just why I do think that there's an inherent scale to the way HTMX works. And I think you had a great podcast or rant a little while ago, which I loved, which
nice.
is about HTMX or about CSS Zen. And that happened in like, what, 2005 or so, maybe 2010. And I remember that being like, this is going to be the future. Like, we're going to like separate the concerns of the styling and all that stuff. And it never panned out. And I really am fearful that HTMX is the exact same thing. That it's giving you this instant gratification of, wow, this is so much simpler than a spa. But as you get farther around, you have more and more tags, you have more and more routes, you have more and more, it feels more like an RPC as you get into the weeds of it. And I think I have a simpler way. And it comes from experience in a completely different industry and a completely different way of thinking about things. So I want to make sure that it's well known that, like, I think HTMX is wrong, but for the right reasons. And to be clear, I don't think Carson's wrong. I think the way people are using HTMX is wrong.
Interesting. And for the HTMX fan who's listening, which like, is it, I don't want to make anybody depressed, but is it fixable, or is it like, do people need to update their mental models to do this? I mean, Datastar obviously, if it has this sort of different approach, and I'll take a look. I'm gonna take a look at it because, first of all, I think it's just the ability to do some of that stuff, even if I just use Datastar for one part of the page or something like that. But it's like, if you need to be able to kind of broadcast this in a way and, be able to do something fast, I don't see how you do that with HTMX or with an SPA. There's just a lot of that. It's like, this to me feels like a new kind of approach. And I appreciate that. And I think that, is there something that is HTMX something that you'd be able to add this to, or is it different enough where it's like you do need to switch your mental model and you need to use more events and you need to, because I don't really use a lot of events, so this would be a big switch in my apps,
Well, and this comes down to the crux of the issue in that I don't think the real time like SSE part is really the interesting part of Datastar. I think that's just this is the way to implement. If you're going to do backend stuff, that's the right way to implement backend stuff, in my opinion. I think the core thing of what makes Datastar a long run win is that it will enable in a marketplace of ideas. Whereas
Yeah.
HTMX, it's Carson's way to do things in a big 4K file. I love the fact that you could completely replace what I've done with the SSE stuff and change it out and do literally rewrite HTMX to be the endpoints that you go to. You can do that. So my thing is more, I wouldn't see it as sprinkle it on the page like HTMX. I really do think it's just like you did wholesale when you looked at the SPA stuff. And you went to HTMX and you said, okay, I'm going to reset my brain of what's capable here. I would like to see you, instead of sprinkling it, even though you can, really take it from first principles and say, how would I do things differently if I had this idea of being able to interact directly and have signals and reactive things built directly into the page. I don't have to add Alpine. I don't have to have hyperscript. I can do these bits of code to turn things on and off and do two-way data binding and all these kinds of things just natively. I don't have to add another library. I have one mental model of things. I think that would really change the way you look at what hypermedia can be, doing it in a purely spec way. I know you can do data dash get and all that stuff with HTMX, but that's not the way you learn it. Like you can do this with Alpine, it's not the way you learn it. If you had one cohesive model for how you deal with hypermedia in a reactive way, I would start there. If you were trying to learn it, and I'm happy, get on the Discord, happy to talk to anybody about this stuff. But it is almost as much of a flip from SPA to HTMX as it is from HTMX to Datastar. And the problem I see is HTMX. I tried to make those changes. I literally was saying, hey, I want to see HTMX more. If you go back in the history of the TypeScript Thunderdome, which basically started from me like yelling at clouds, I was literally trying to make these changes so that Carson could be wrong about this or that, and I could say, hey, I could prove out this module is better and pick and choose the things that like we did, but it's just not with that mental model in place. So I don't know if it's fixable in HTMX. I already tried to fix it and it wasn't desired. It wasn't a desirable thing in their mind.
Right.
So I don't think so. I don't think you can fix HTMX at this point.
Interesting.
Because it's not broken. I mean, HTMX sucks is a beautiful article, an essay, but the problem is all the things in there. I feel like he cribbed off conversations we've had or like things that he's heard. Like I brought up every single one of those issues, and the issue is not that he's basically saying don't use HTMX if this doesn't make if any of these things don't make sense to you. Like this is what HTMX is. If you don't like it, cool. Like find something else. Well, I couldn't find something else, so I ended up having to write. But I literally started with not HTMX2 because before HTMX2 was out, I built a whole thing in TypeScript to try to fix these things, and it wasn't seen as an issue. Like just like why would you do that? That's dumb. It's basically the response from the community, not from Carson himself. So
right.
I've already tried to fix HTMX.
Yep. Interesting. So, okay. Maybe I'll just, this is just fascinating to me, this whole concept. So, I'll just finish with that, or, we can, I would be curious, and maybe at some point I can check in with you. I take an old app. Can I put some of this Datastar concept into that old app?
Yeah, I actually think it's better with Brownfield than HTMX because by default it can change any point on any point of any screen. So it's like it's doing the out of bound swap stuff, but it's also doing all the morph down model. I think it's way easier to add into an existing project than HTMX is.
And you'd sort of like add a single route that would be your new sort of handler for that. Like right now I have an app with let's say 200 routes defined, and each one does its own page and all this kind of stuff. You might add in, I guess what I'm worried about, and I'll just like sort of, I'm worried about one solution that takes over and that you sort of have to change your whole approach. One of the things that I have really appreciated about HTMX is I have all kinds of apps that I've built over the last 20 years. I use Vue, I use just PHP, I use jQuery, like all these things. HTMX has played nicely with all of them. And I've been able to just kind of incorporate it and use it as much or as little as I need. And what like my little alarm, my little fear when I'm sort of talking to you about the Datastar setup is, do I need to rethink how I do my app in terms of, I don't have any events, I don't use them. I don't have an event bus that's running on my server nonstop. So do I need to rethink? And I'm not opposed to rethinking, especially building a new app and doing something incredible. Like I love to sort of figure these kind of, and being able to kind of rethink how I do stuff. That's fine. But just on a purely logistical level, if I go into to make add a feature that's really nice in an old app, how much do I have to rethink the architecture of that old app?
Zero. The whole thing is that I think basically Datastar is just a superset of what you can do in HTMX. The way that I like to do things is a very real-time, gamer-centric style of mental model. But you could do the same fragments and call it a day and do the exact same routes and do exactly what you're doing in HTMX. I think you're missing out on things, but you can 100% do it that way. And then the nice thing is because everything is using that same style, whether you sent one event down or you sent 10,000 events down, it's the exact same code. So as you add more and more, you could scale up your thing. So you can just do it straight and drop in replacement. In fact, there's probably a way to do hx get. Well, there's so many tags, you'll end up having a lot less tags. But in general, I can help you work through an HTMX thing and just say, okay, add Datastar to the top, same one-line CDN thing like you have now, and like just step through it and say, you're not getting as much value, I think, out of it, but at the same time, if you already added hyperscript or outline or something to your app, now you can just delete that and we can start going through and cleaning things up. And I guarantee you'll have less code.
Yeah.
Even for the same mental model.
Interesting. So I almost wish there were like the Olympics of web development or something like that, where you could like go
take all
and
comers.
Like I would love to like see, I don't know if Ryan Florence is, I think there were some people at Big Sky, but also just in general, who I'm trying to remember who some of the sort of main things were, but the big concept is I'm using an SPA because I don't want to be limited. And I feel like
you're limiting yourself.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I think it's like, you switch if you're willing to go with hypermedia, you're accepting these certain limitations. And I've been trying to push against those boundaries myself and try to build. So what I would love to see is just examples. And you said, you have that nice example of the Apple image, the video and stuff like that. So things like that, people just don't think are possible. Like I would love to see, and I don't know that this exists. It's just, it's all about who has the most, the loudest microphone right now.
I mean, that's definitely the case.
So this is why like a merit-based, like here's different implementations of the same site. Here's the thing that SPA people think is the fanciest, coolest thing. Here it is done, using web transitions in the browser mixed with some, Datastar, like for the back end. And like, I feel like there's just these possibilities that people don't even know about, which I don't know about either. And I just want to like, I really appreciate you talking about them with me.
Yeah, absolutely. It was interesting going to that conference because it was primarily React and Vue developers because it was a Utah JS conference. And I basically said at the end of the talk, like, I understand why Carson doesn't want to use Datastar, right? Like he's happy where he's happy and he's good. But I don't understand why the rest of you don't. I really don't, because I'm throwing down the gauntlet of I'm showing you real-time 3D applications. I'm doing all kinds of interesting things. And I'm doing stuff that you can't do. I know because I've done the same things. And I'm doing them in less code. Like my entire 3D engine with a full quest system and all the stuff is, including all of the logic to fill it out, is 400 lines of like temple code. Like it's so simple because I'm just taking the source of truth, which is the game engine, and during that tick, creating some HTML, and it's so tiny compared to the way that you're doing it. I would love it if it was metrics based. And the only person that's really talking about how good Datastar is literally Carson. Carson's the biggest voice that's actually taking it seriously. In fact, I have one of the HTMX discs from the thing, and it literally, he wrote on it, people should try Datastar on the HTMX 2.0 thing. So it's weird because the biggest voice is the person that we should be at odds, and we're not. We just disagree on implementation, not on the ideas. So I don't know how to get the word out better. I don't want to be a framework guy. Like, I don't want to be the Datastar guy. I'm hoping to Tom Sawyer or Theseus ship this. So over time, none of my code exists. And I can just use these beautiful ideas that other people have done. That's the hope, is that none of my code exists in a year from now, that it's gotten popular enough that people have written better versions of what I'm doing.
Interesting. So you could have a, somewhere out there, there's a page of demos and you haven't had to build all of them.
Yeah, well, if you actually go to the examples page of Datastar, I took every single HTMX example and I ported them over. So that should help you, because it's literally a one-to-one with what the original one is, except for I may add in features that you cannot do in HTMX without adding Alpine or something like that. So there'll be slightly different version, but it's all the HTMX examples. I ported every single one of them. And then I have a bunch of other examples. So I have over, I think, 50 examples on the page that are showing all the different versions of what you can do. So I already have those in place. I just don't know how to get the word out in a better way without becoming, I don't want to go to every conference and just yell at the clouds. I'm like, look, I almost kept it secret. I almost was like, I'm just going to do it this way. It gives me a superpower. No one else can compete. But at the same time, I want to see better ideas out there.
Yeah. I'm glad. Don't keep it secret. Don't keep it safe.
Don't worry. There's only like 12 of us that use it actively. But what's interesting is the people that use it are doing hardcore medical imagery stuff. A couple of military applications back in the space I used to work in. AI, real-time AI inferencing thing. It's getting used. The people that are using it are in hardcore problems. But everyone else doesn't seem to know or care yet.
So I don't want to I don't want to give you any work that you don't already ready to do, but you've already done a ton, but the HTMX world is relatively niche and small already. So your website, if people see it as an offshoot of HTMX, the comparison, the direct, it's helpful for me as someone who's gone deep into HTMX. I wonder if you put Datastar up against the Reacts, the Views, and showed that we're not limited. This is not oh, you're using hypermedia, so you need to use some other Datastar. HTMX doesn't have everything. But people who, I think the comparison versus the SPA is the really interesting one. And that's the one that when people talk to me about it, and that happened at Big Sky, a lot of people were like, I wouldn't use HTMX because I don't want to come across some limitation where I can't do something in the front end. And I think that React versus, maybe you don't want to get into a versus type relationship, but in terms of just merit and in terms of capability and all these kind of things, I think if there's an examples that, maybe expanding beyond HTMX as a comparison, not just to show mental model, but just to show capability versus React and Vue, I think could be useful for people.
Yeah, if there's I wish there was a better version of the to-do MVC that was actually a real world, here's 1,000 different streams and you have to update a page, and a chat, building a chat app is less than an hour in Datastar. It's building a full Discord equivalent app is so dead easy. I don't even know how to, I literally could just do it on stage and show how easy it is and say, if you have a better way to do this in React, I'm all ears. I don't know how to be that confrontational though, because I was one of those people. I drank the Kool-Aid. I did all the things. So it's more of the wake up sheeple or something. I don't know. I'm not as meme heavy as Carson. It's just we're all doing it
Me
wrong.
neither.
And the problem is we're doing it wrong, and now HTMX is doing it wrong too. So how do we fix this? And my hope is that someone comes up with a better idea and then makes a declarative plugin so that I can hook into just the way that you see SSE is this magic sauce, right? You saw man, that's a mental model that I can get behind. That's just a plugin, man. You could rip that out and do it a different way. Someone come up with a better thing. I have some really interesting ideas around web transport when that becomes available everywhere, which is what WebSockets should have been. They'll allow you to do things that WebRTC does and WebSockets can do, but in a unified way. and quick. So there's a lot of things around there that I'm gonna be doing some hardcore plug. Like you could build a first-person shooter in that with hypermedia, and I'm gonna be writing plugins for that. But the plugins that are there are good and done. Like so, I want to see people explore the ideas of hypermedia more than I care about the implementation. I just don't know what that led to. Because the problem is, it's almost like a benchmark. You could totally game that in a million ways. And people are like, oh, look how fast I'm updating my screen. I'm like, yeah, but you're updating. I can also do that because again, it's just declarative. I'm still writing TypeScript or JavaScript to drive that thing. So anything you can do in React, I can guarantee you I can do in Datastar.
Well, and like just to throw a little like, bonus in there, you're potentially doing that on 1,000 computers at once,
Yeah,
right?
100%.
I mean, this is like, so, you do something in React, you're doing it locally,
Right.
and you can maybe, I don't know, it's like, I sometimes wonder what exactly they're talking about in terms of like user experience. Like, is it like the transition from one div to another, like the fact that it doesn't, like whatever that sort of experience that
Well,
is like they really want, like whatever that is, you can deliver that to multiple people at once.
and see, the thing that was interesting is one person said, I really think that this approach is flawed. Like when I click on a add user button, I can show that add user thing instantly. And I'm like, okay, that's great for the hello world or like the getting started. But like in the real world, like I deal with military stuff. You have things called dissemination controls. And all of a sudden those can change on the fly. So as soon as you say, I want to add a new user, there's a lot of checks to happen to see if you're actually able to add that user and what that interface is to you. Because if you're on a SIPR or Nipper network or all these things, that interface changes depending on context. And I think a lot of people that miss in the SPA and the React world is they're talking about their little happy path as opposed to the like context of what the real world is happening and what's going on. Like you may not be allowed to see the thing, or you may get a special bonus for this time of year, or like whatever. There's a lot going on to adding a user, and as soon as you get off the happy path in React or Vue, it's a nightmare. Like there's so many checks,
Yeah.
there's so many things, there's so many things you're turning on and off, and also the thing is, at least from a military standpoint, it's not secure. All of your logic is right there. Someone can literally look at your divs and see, oh, if I had access to that thing, I could turn this thing on, and you find vectors for dealing with things. So for me, it's about security and all these other things that we're not even talking about real time. It's just talking about the security of hypermedia versus a native app. It's a
Yeah, I mean,
different.
a source of truth, it has to be your server. So
Yeah.
like one of my big things, and I did an episode on this as well. It's just like, why do it twice? Like you have your source of truth
Yep.
already. You need that. You cannot, and I've seen some Twitter battles on that too.
Well, I really would look like I didn't talk to Ryan Florence at the thing, and I haven't really talked to much of the developers of the frameworks, but I would take any comer for any frame. If they're like, I can make something you can't make, like I want the Ryan Florence thing of like, here's a React app, you can't do it, and I will make it faster and smaller and use less resources. I guarantee it. I just need to see the app to like show me because I'm ready to go. I just don't know how to get the word out that
There's no Olympics,
I'm
man.
not better, but my approach is better. If that makes
Yeah,
sense.
no,
And you would be better if you use this approach. Like if you're a good developer, you'd be great in this.
right. Yeah, there's no Web Olympics, and somehow there needs to be. Somehow there needs to be some sort of not just a benchmark, but actual like. And I think Adam Wathan from Tailwind has talked about this a bunch, where
Mm-hmm.
he's like, people are like, "Ah, Tailwind's crap. Like you can't do real stuff with it," and it's like, and this was early on. Now,
Yeah.
obviously, everybody uses it, so everybody knows it's good, or but it's like his big thing was like, let me go up against somebody like one on one. You build it with CSS or whatever your version is, and I'll build it with Tailwind, and we'll see like which is faster and which is easier. It's like
Yeah.
I do wish there was something, because this sounds
I
like,
agree. I feel
yeah,
it's such a because the problem is that you can easily get into the code golf where you're like, look, I made it this percent smaller. This like I didn't mean
yeah,
for Datastar to be smaller than HTMX. I actually thought it would be bigger because I'm doing a lot more stuff. I'm including multiple libraries worth of stuff, right? But the fact that it's smaller is a benefit. The same thing happens here where if I can show that it's less code, it's less stuff over the wire, and the code you write is simpler, like I can easily see that saying, "Oh, you're just playing code golf." But like, I want to look at the metrics of the machine. I want to look at like how many resources you're using. Like I did that when I did that talk. I did a full 3D engine with a quest system teaching lessons with a 3D city at 144 frames a second of stuff, and it had a NAT server embedded, so all the pub sub, all the key value, persistence, all that stuff, a full HTTP2 server, all this stuff, and it was 13 megabytes. The executable is tiny, and I think that matters because that means your Docker containers are smaller. It means it'll run on my little junk laptop or on a Epic system, and I don't have to make any changes to it. It also, like, there's a lot of things that I think people aren't looking at when they look at a framework. Like most of the things we talked about for your application had to do with, like, let's talk about your database. Let's talk about how you're making your data. Almost none of it has to do with Datastar. Datastar, I think once you get into the details of building with it, you're going to see it as you're going to laugh because you're like, oh, that's it. Oh, I can just, then you just get to your actual problem. So
yeah, well, that's how I felt about HTMX as well. I mean, for me,
well,
that was a big mental, yeah.
I think it goes even farther. I really do.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I'll start to wrap up here because this has been fascinating. And I'll just like kind of big picture. I think Carson has the right mentality of some of this stuff. Of hypermedia is a big tent, and like I think what you're doing with hypermedia and with pushing those boundaries is awesome. And I think it's like I think the bigger picture of pushing back on some of the SPA stuff, and like I'm not even interested in like an argument over it. I just think like the experience and this is a better thing for some developers, and some developers are always going to love sort of the React and the problems they're solving work great in that space, but a lot of problems, more than people think, fit under the hypermedia umbrella. And I think the bigger that umbrella is, and the more stuff that we can do, just the better. So I think this is awesome. Datastar is awesome. So I really appreciate it.
Essay page, I actually have a thing called Grugs Around the Fire. It was one of the first little essays I wrote about we all see ourselves as Grugs. We just are worried about different ideas of what complex is.
Okay, yeah.
So I would highly recommend taking a look because, I do really think that we're all just trying to get back to simplicity. It's just I tend to worry about day 2 simplicity as opposed to caring about day 1 as much.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Nice. I'll check that out. Awesome. I'll include a link as well in the podcast liner notes. Awesome. So, well, thank you very much for talking today. This was great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Glad to get the word out. So.
Yep. Anytime.